The millionaire helped his secretary pick up the folder she had dropped. But then he saw a familiar bracelet on her wrist and almost fainted. In the upper echelons of the business world, David Grant was a name that demanded respect. Known for his unwavering focus and demanding nature, he'd built his fortune through discipline, precision, and a reputation for letting nothing slip through the cracks. His office, a towering suite in the heart of the city, mirrored his character. Imposing, sleek, and meticulously organized. Silver-gray furniture lined the pristine room, each piece an extension of his formidable presence, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city he dominated. David himself was as polished as his surroundings, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. His every movement spoke of a man in control. He was known for his penetrating gaze that made lesser men stammer and, more often than not, his notorious lack of patience, rarely one for small talk or personal bonds. His life had become his empire, the people in it mere cogs that kept his kingdom turning. Friends and family were casualties of his ambition, distant memories he'd buried in pursuit of success. If he felt any remorse for it, he kept it hidden behind that stoic exterior. On this particular morning, he was focused on a significant merger proposal. His intense concentration was undisturbed as he glanced over the data, lost in figures and logistics. Today's meeting was critical, and he demanded nothing less than perfection from himself and those around him. His staff knew better than to interrupt his process, let alone falter. Yet, as he turned to prepare for his next meeting, he was unaware that something small, something seemingly insignificant, would disrupt his rigid world. A simple incident that would unravel years of carefully maintained detachment. It would start with a secretary, a misplaced folder, and a bracelet whose familiarity would strike him with a force he'd never anticipated. Emma Collins rushed through the halls of Grant Industries, clutching a heavy stack of folders against her chest. It was her first week on the job, and she was still adjusting to the unspoken rules of working for David Grant. The unbreakable silences, the constant deadlines, and the strict standard of perfection that weighed on every member of his team. Her job as his personal secretary was a demanding one, requiring constant vigilance to avoid the slightest misstep. After all, David Grant was known as much for his intolerance of errors as for his business acumen. Today was especially crucial, and her nerves buzzed with urgency. She'd spent hours compiling reports, aligning documents, and ensuring everything was flawless for the big meeting. As she rounded a corner just outside David's office, her heel caught the edge of the carpet. Before she could steady herself, the folders slipped from her grasp, and papers scattered like autumn leaves all over the polished marble floor. A wave of panic surged through her. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the pages before anyone could notice, especially him. Heart pounding, she quickly snatched up papers, her hands fumbling as she tried to regain control. She cursed her clumsiness silently, acutely aware that David expected nothing less than precision from those who worked for him. Then, to her utter horror, she saw the familiar polished leather shoes step into her view. She looked up, finding herself face to face with her intimidating boss. He was watching her with an unreadable expression. Expecting a reprimand, she opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could utter a word, he bent down to help her pick up the scattered documents. The gesture caught her off guard. David Grant was not a man who typically concerned himself with others' missteps, let alone extended a helping hand. She murmured a nervous, "Thank you," as he gathered a few papers, but she couldn't shake the sense that something about him had changed in that moment. David reached out to hand Emma a folder when something caught his eye. Draped around her wrist was a bracelet, a simple silver chain with a small, heart-shaped charm dangling from it. He froze mid-motion, the folder still in his hand. His expression shifted, an almost imperceptible crack in his composed demeanor. For a brief moment, he felt his grip weaken, and the world around him blurred. That bracelet, it couldn't be. But there it was, right in front of him, impossible to ignore. 1,000 memories crashed over him, memories he'd long buried, memories of a life he'd left behind. He felt an unsteady chill ripple through him, and he quickly forced himself to focus, willing himself not to betray the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. He glanced away, pretending to adjust the documents in his hands, and took a slow, steadying breath. Emma, who had been nervously collecting the last few sheets, sensed something unusual in her boss's demeanor. She glanced up to see his face, softened for a brief instant, before he reassembled his composed expression. She caught herself staring, wondering if she had somehow imagined the whole thing. There was no reason he'd be so affected by something as trivial as her bracelet. Was there? "Is everything all right, Mr. Grant?" she asked softly, genuinely concerned. He straightened, clearing his throat. "Yes, of course. Just be careful next time, Miss Collins." His voice, while steady, held an unusual hesitation. As he watched her slide the bracelet back under her sleeve, he couldn't stop the flood of emotions. That bracelet had belonged to someone he'd lost years ago, someone he thought he'd never see again. For the rest of the day, David found himself haunted by that silver chain, unable to concentrate, his mind spiraling with questions. A door had been opened in David's mind, one he wasn't sure he was prepared to walk through. But now, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd encountered a ghost from his past. In the days that followed, David found himself watching Emma more closely. His usual aloofness seemed to slip away whenever she was nearby. He began seeking opportunities to engage with her, subtly steering conversations toward her background or her family, all while trying not to reveal the real reason behind his curiosity. For David, this was a significant departure from his usual manner. Known for his strict professionalism, he was the last person to linger in small talk or express a personal interest in his employees. Emma, naturally, was confused but flattered. She couldn't quite believe that her powerful, often distant boss was suddenly so attentive. His glances in her direction, the careful questions, and the way he would quietly listen when she spoke, it all made her wonder if she'd done something remarkable to earn his favor. But as flattered as she was, Emma couldn't ignore the unsettling feeling that something else was motivating him, something she couldn't understand. As David became more drawn to her, he noticed small things about her that he hadn't before. Her laugh, which was quick and genuine, felt somehow familiar. The way she nervously brushed a strand of hair from her face when she was focused reminded him of someone he hadn't allowed himself to think about in years. She had a gentleness to her that seemed foreign in the corporate world but was somehow endearing. But these feelings left David uneasy. How could he, a man who valued distance and control, suddenly feel so drawn to someone he barely knew? The more he tried to brush off his instincts, the stronger they became, gnawing at him with an intensity that disturbed his carefully managed life. He found himself arriving to work early, eager for the chance to cross paths with her. Every conversation became an opportunity, every passing interaction a moment that felt oddly significant. As much as David wanted to stay detached, his growing fascination with Emma was beginning to blur the lines of his structured world, and he couldn't stop himself from wondering why. David's curiosity continued to grow, and he started asking Emma subtle questions about her background. Their conversations, once strictly professional, began to touch on personal details, topics David would never have explored under normal circumstances. When he asked about her family, her answer intrigued him. "Well, I never knew my biological family," Emma said one afternoon, her tone casual, though her eyes hinted at a longing she'd clearly carried for years. "I was raised in foster care. I guess I was one of the unlucky ones, never finding a permanent home." A pang shot through David's heart. The idea of her growing up alone, without family, sparked a strange mix of emotions within him. He listened as she described the challenges she'd faced and the resilience she'd built in the process, her voice tinged with bittersweet nostalgia. There was something raw and genuine in her story, something that stirred memories David had buried for decades. "So you don't know anything about your family?" he asked, carefully controlling his tone. She shook her head with a wistful smile. "Nothing. I was found at a very young age with no identification or family records. The only thing they found with me was," she paused, glancing down at her wrist, "this bracelet. It's all I've ever had from Well, whoever they were. David's gaze fell to the bracelet again, his mind racing. That bracelet had belonged to his younger sister, who had disappeared from his life under tragic circumstances. He hadn't seen or heard from her since. For a moment, the thought that Emma could somehow be connected to his lost past seemed absurd, even impossible. But the more he considered it, the more the coincidence gnawed at him, refusing to let go. As Emma continued working, David realized that he couldn't dismiss his suspicions. The bracelet, her story, her familiar mannerisms, all of it pulled at a part of his soul he thought had turned to stone. He knew he had to pursue the truth, even if he wasn't sure he was ready for the answers. Over the next few days, David could think of little else. He began piecing together every scrap of information he had about Emma. Her background, her mannerisms, the bracelet that now felt like a ghost from his past. He found himself obsessively replaying their conversations, looking for hidden clues, hints that could confirm or dismiss the suspicion that was overtaking him. He tried to convince himself it was impossible. After all, he'd searched for his sister for years with no success. The heartbreak of losing her had left a scar that he'd buried beneath his ambition, using work as an escape from the painful memories. But now, every time he saw Emma, the same thoughts surfaced, persistent and unrelenting, like a puzzle he couldn't put down. David started noticing how Emma's eyes crinkled when she laughed, the same way his sister's had. The small tilt of her head when she was deep in thought mirrored a gesture he thought he'd long forgotten. Even her smile, a warm, open expression, carried an echo of a person he'd lost long ago. As each day passed, the similarities became impossible to ignore, each one adding to the feeling of familiarity that haunted him. He was torn between hope and caution. Part of him wanted to believe that fate had finally brought her back into his life, that Emma was somehow connected to the sister he'd loved so deeply. Yet another part of him feared the truth. What if he was wrong? What if he'd let his emotions cloud his judgment, risking his sanity for a mere coincidence? With each passing day, David felt himself unraveling, his once rigid control slipping away. He couldn't concentrate on his work, couldn't keep his mind from wandering every time Emma passed by his office. He knew that the only way to silence his doubts was to find answers, whatever they might be. The urge to uncover the truth, to confirm his suspicions, grew stronger with each sleepless night, leaving him at the brink of a life-altering decision. David's growing fascination with Emma soon translated into actions that surprised everyone, especially her. He began to show a side of himself that few at the company had ever seen: compassionate, attentive, and even generous. He'd always kept his relationships at work purely professional, yet with Emma, he found himself drawn to moments where he could offer advice or support. Whenever she encountered a problem, he made a point of stepping in, guiding her through it with patience and a quiet confidence that put her at ease. Emma couldn't help but feel astonished. She had heard countless stories of David's intimidating demeanor and demanding standards. Yet, here he was, taking her under his wing, helping her navigate the challenges of her new position with a kindness she hadn't expected. His guidance was invaluable, and she was grateful. She began to wonder if her dedication to her job had somehow earned his respect. Over time, their interactions transformed. David went from being the distant boss who towered above everyone to a mentor she could rely on. He shared stories of his early struggles in business, explaining lessons he'd learned the hard way. His honesty surprised her, making her realize that beneath his tough exterior was a man who had faced his own hardships. Emma found herself inspired by his journey, motivated to prove herself and make the most of the rare chance he'd given her. But for David, every moment they spent together only intensified the bond he was beginning to feel. He found himself caring about her well-being, worrying if she seemed stressed, feeling proud of her small victories as if they were his own. And with each day, his suspicions and hopes grew, leaving him more conflicted than ever. Emma had become someone he couldn't simply categorize as another employee. She was someone who stirred a longing in him he'd buried long ago. David's mind was restless, consumed by the possibility that Emma could be connected to his past in ways he'd never imagined. His suspicion had become too pressing to ignore, and he knew he needed concrete answers to either confirm his hopes or put them to rest. But he couldn't just ask Emma outright. The questions in his mind were too personal, too fragile to handle without proof. One evening, as he stood in his office watching her finish her work for the day, he devised a plan. If he could find a way to collect a small DNA sample, something discreet and unnoticeable, he could finally confirm or disprove his theory. The idea was invasive, and he wrestled with his conscience, feeling both desperate and guilty. But the need to know overwhelmed any reservations he had. A few days later, the opportunity presented itself. Emma had left her coffee mug on her desk as she hurried off to a late meeting. David hesitated, heart pounding as he approached her desk. He could feel the ethical lines he was crossing, but his yearning for answers spurred him on. Quickly, he picked up the mug, carefully placing it in a small bag to preserve any evidence. The entire act felt surreal, as if he were watching himself from afar, his usually composed demeanor shaken by an emotion he couldn't control. The sample was sent to a private lab, one he trusted to keep the results confidential. And then came the waiting, a slow, torturous stretch of days that seemed endless. During this time, David continued to interact with Emma, his emotions a mixture of hope, anxiety, and guilt. He knew that whatever the outcome, his relationship with her would change irrevocably. Every time he looked at her, he felt a pang of both excitement and fear, wondering what answers the test might bring. For the first time in years, David felt vulnerable, his calm exterior masking the storm within as he anxiously awaited the truth. The days that followed were some of the longest of David's life. Every time he glanced at his phone or checked his email, his heart lurched with anticipation, only to feel the sting of disappointment as no results arrived. He found himself plagued by an uncharacteristic restlessness, glancing at the door whenever Emma walked by, each interaction carrying a weight that was invisible to her but crushing to him. In those days of waiting, David's attachment to Emma grew more intense. He couldn't stop himself from looking out for her, feeling a strange sense of responsibility and protectiveness that was at once bewildering and undeniable. When she struggled with a project, he'd offer guidance without hesitation. When she appeared tired, he'd subtly suggest she take a break, as if he were a concerned guardian instead of a stoic CEO. Emma, for her part, was puzzled but appreciative. She couldn't fathom why her usually reserved boss had suddenly taken such a personal interest in her well-being. She noticed his lingering glances, his quiet gestures of support, and while she couldn't understand the reason, she felt grateful for his presence. There was a warmth in him she hadn't expected, and she felt herself relaxing around him, seeing beyond his reputation and into the caring man who seemed to be watching over her. Yet for David, the suspense was excruciating. His nights became restless, his thoughts consumed by the prospect of discovering the truth. He wondered how he would handle the revelation if Emma were truly connected to him, how it would impact both his life and hers. What if she wasn't? Could he go back to the distance and detachment he'd kept with everyone else, now that he'd allowed himself to care so deeply? The days stretched into what felt like an eternity until, finally, he received a notification. The lab results had arrived. David hesitated, bracing himself as he prepared to confront the answer he'd waited for, an answer that would change everything. David sat alone in his office, staring at the unopened email from the lab. His finger hovered over the mouse, his heart pounding as he fought the urge to delay what he knew he had to face. Everything he had felt over the past weeks, the suspicion, the hope, the fear, had led to this moment. And now, with the answer within reach, he wasn't sure he was ready. Finally, he took a deep breath and clicked. The report loaded, and he skimmed over the technical jargon until his eyes settled on the words that seemed to leap off the screen. No genetic match found. The world seemed to go silent. He sat back, the impact of those 4 words crashing over him with a force he hadn't anticipated. Emma was not his daughter. She was not the missing piece of family he had secretly hoped she might be. His mind struggled to accept it, as if some part of him had already made peace with the idea of finding his sister's legacy in this young woman who'd unknowingly rekindled something in him he thought was long dead. David felt a bitter pang of grief, his throat tightening. He hadn't realized until now just how deeply he'd wanted the answer to be different. Yet here he was, faced with a reality he couldn't change. He closed his eyes, letting the disappointment sink in, feeling an emptiness that was almost unbearable. But there was something else too, a realization he hadn't expected. Though Emma wasn't biologically related to him, the bond he felt wasn't diminished by the results. The protectiveness, the care, the responsibility he felt, it wasn't just about family blood. He cared about Emma for who she was, and that realization gave him a strange sense of peace. She had become someone important to him regardless of the outcome. For David, a decision became clear. He would continue to be there for her, a mentor and perhaps something more, embracing a bond that went beyond DNA. In the days that followed, David found himself embracing his connection to Emma in a way that was more profound than before. The DNA test had stripped away his hopes for a biological link, but in doing so, it had revealed a deeper truth. He cared about her, not because of who she might have been, but because of who she was. He realized that he'd become something of a father figure to her, a role that both frightened and fulfilled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. Emma sensed the shift too. David's mentorship became more personal, his guidance extending beyond mere work-related tasks. He encouraged her to pursue her ideas confidently, reminding her that her voice mattered. He began sharing stories from his past, speaking about mistakes he had made and the values he had learned the hard way. Emma noticed how his once distant demeanor had softened, and in his presence, she found a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced before. One evening, as they wrapped up after a long day of work, David offered to walk her to her car. They strolled through the quiet parking lot, the city lights casting a soft glow over the scene. For the first time, she felt comfortable enough to share her own dreams, her hopes for the future, her desire to find stability and success despite her challenging past. David listened intently, realizing how much she reminded him of himself at her age. Determined, resilient, yet carrying the weight of her history. He felt a strange pride in her achievements, seeing in her the drive and courage he'd once had, qualities he was glad to help nurture in her. Emma's gratitude was apparent, and as she looked at him, she felt warmth toward him that she couldn't quite explain. To her, David was no longer just a boss or a mentor. He was someone she could look up to, someone she trusted. Unbeknownst to her, he had come to feel the same way, their connection rooted not in biology but in choice and trust. Though David had accepted the truth that Emma wasn't his daughter, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that there was more to the story. He found himself returning to that bracelet, the one so identical to his sister's. It was an uncanny reminder of the life he'd left behind, a life filled with unanswered questions and unspoken regrets. And though he tried to move forward, the lingering familiarity in Emma's eyes and mannerisms continued to haunt him. David wrestled with his emotions, torn between his rational mind and the instincts that wouldn't let him rest. He didn't want to disrupt the rapport they'd built with wild theories or dredge up old wounds that might not even be connected. But the pull was undeniable. Despite the test results, something deep inside him told him there was a missing piece, something he couldn't see but could feel, lurking just out of reach. In a quiet moment of contemplation, David began researching his sister's life again, something he hadn't done in years. Old photos, faded letters, and scattered memories resurfaced as he pieced together the fragments of her past, looking for clues he might have overlooked. In the back of his mind, a single question echoed. Could Emma somehow still be part of the family he'd lost? One night, after hours of searching, he came across a forgotten detail. His sister had once been involved with someone who had vanished from her life under uncertain circumstances. This man had always remained a mystery, and it was possible, though improbable, that he could have fathered a child. Could Emma be connected to his estranged brother through that unknown man? The possibility was faint, but it rekindled his determination to pursue the truth, leading him to consider yet another DNA test. David resolved to take one final step, determined to either lay his questions to rest or finally unravel the enigma that connected him to Emma. David's investigation led him to a surprising and bittersweet revelation. While revisiting his sister's life, he uncovered news that her estranged partner, a man David had never known well, had passed away recently. This discovery stirred something within him, reopening old wounds he thought had healed. Could this man have had a child who might have been lost in the foster system as Emma had been? The thought felt wild but plausible. With new determination, David arranged for a second DNA test, this time under the assumption that Emma might be his niece. He went about the process quietly, determined not to raise her suspicions. For days, he replayed memories in his mind, moments he'd shared with his sister before she left, before her life spiraled beyond his reach. The idea that he might have missed out on a connection with his own family, that Emma could be the last living piece of his beloved sister, left him hopeful and fearful all at once. He began to imagine what it might be like to have family once more, to have someone to whom he could pass on not only his legacy but also the love he had buried after so many losses. As he waited for the results, David found himself sharing more of his life with Emma, almost as if he were preparing her for what he hoped would come. He told her stories of his childhood, carefully revealing bits of his family's history, the memories of his sister, and the loss that had left an empty place in his heart. Emma listened with gentle curiosity, sensing that there was something deeper behind his stories but not pressing him for answers. In her presence, David felt a strange peace settle over him. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the hope of reconnecting with his past, hoping for a future that might finally offer the family he'd lost. When the results arrived, David found himself once again alone in his office, his hands trembling as he opened the report. His breath caught as he scanned the page, his eyes settling on the words that confirmed what he'd been hoping for, yet hardly dared to believe. Positive match, biological relation confirmed. Emma was his niece. An overwhelming wave of emotions surged within him, a complex blend of joy, sorrow, and profound relief. His instincts had been right all along, the strange connection he'd felt with her explained by the blood they shared. His sister's legacy had in fact survived, and the last remnant of his family was here, working by his side, completely unaware of the bond between them. David's eyes misted as he sat back in his chair, letting the truth sink in. His sister, whom he had lost so tragically, had left him a final gift in Emma. He now understood why her laughter, her small gestures, and even her strength felt so familiar. Emma had inherited not only his sister's bracelet but also her spirit, her resilience, and her warmth. And here she was, ready to become a part of his life in a way he had never anticipated. After a moment of quiet reflection, David's thoughts turned to how he would share this truth with her. He realized the weight of the responsibility he now carried, the delicate path he'd have to tread to honor her past while opening the door to a new future. The realization filled him with purpose. He would tell her gently, giving her the respect and space she deserved to process this revelation. More importantly, he resolved to support her in any way she needed, knowing that he would be there to guide, protect, and care for her, not just as a mentor but as family. The next day, David invited Emma to his office, his heart heavy with anticipation. As she entered, she sensed a seriousness in his demeanor, an intensity that hinted at something important. She took a seat, watching as he gathered his thoughts, his eyes reflecting a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. "Emma," he began, his voice calm but laced with emotion, "there's something I need to tell you. It's something I've only recently discovered, and it may come as a shock." Emma leaned forward, her curiosity tempered by a growing apprehension. She could see the weight of his words pressing on him, and she braced herself for whatever revelation he was about to share. David took a deep breath. "The bracelet you wear, the one you said was with you since you were a child, belonged to my sister." He paused, watching the confusion flicker in her eyes. "And as it turns out, you're her daughter. You're my niece." The room fell silent. Emma stared at him, her mind reeling as she tried to process his words. She looked down at her wrist, at the bracelet that had always been her only link to a past she'd never known. Now, suddenly, that past was alive, standing before her in the form of this man she'd thought of only as her boss. "You're my family," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and disbelief. David nodded, his eyes softening. "Yes, Emma. I had no idea until recently. But you are. You're my family, the only family I have left." The reality sank in, and Emma felt an overwhelming rush of emotions. Joy, confusion, grief for the family she'd never known, and relief that at last she belonged somewhere. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at him, her expression mirroring his own raw vulnerability. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. David reached out, his hand warm and steady. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that I'm here, now and always." The days that followed were filled with quiet moments of adjustment, as both David and Emma slowly began to navigate their new dynamic. Though they had always shared a professional rapport, something had shifted between them, a deep, unspoken bond that went beyond the office walls. The revelation of their familial connection had added layers of trust, affection, and warmth to their relationship, and they both felt the gravity of the change. David found himself more protective of Emma than ever before. He made sure to check in on her not just professionally but personally, asking about her day and listening intently to her plans. He had spent so many years in isolation, his success hollowed by the absence of family, that now, with Emma in his life, he felt an overwhelming need to make up for lost time. He wanted to be the uncle, the mentor, and the family member that she deserved. For Emma, the transition was equally profound. She had spent so long trying to find a sense of belonging, first in foster care and then in the demanding world of corporate life. The revelation that she had family, that she was not alone, filled her with a sense of security she'd never had before. David's kindness and genuine care gave her something she hadn't known she needed, a place to rest, both physically and emotionally. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, built on trust and mutual respect. Emma no longer saw David as just her boss. He was now someone who had become her family, someone she could rely on. In return, David found in Emma the warmth he had longed for, someone to share not only his legacy but also his life. Together they worked side by side, now united not just by business but by blood, a family reunited through fate, circumstance, and a shared desire for connection. As the weeks passed, David found himself reflecting on the twists and turns his life had taken. He'd always been a man of control, focused on success, building an empire that had come to define him. But in the quiet moments, when he wasn't consumed by work or his responsibilities, he found himself contemplating the choices he had made, the family he had lost, and the second chance he had been given with Emma. He thought back to the years after his sister's disappearance, the guilt that had eaten at him, the questions that had lingered unanswered. David had buried his feelings, convincing himself that he was better off alone, that he could handle everything without anyone by his side. He had made peace with his solitude, or so he thought. But now, looking at Emma, who was as much a stranger as she was a reflection of his past, he realized how much he had missed the connection of family. David's mind often wandered to what might have been. What if he had fought harder to keep his sister close? What if he had known Emma earlier, been there for her when she needed him most? He couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. And in Emma, he saw an opportunity to make things right, not just for himself but for her as well. His heart swelled with gratitude as he saw the growth in Emma, the way she blossomed under his mentorship and support. She was no longer the nervous, uncertain woman who had first walked into his office. She was confident, thoughtful, and thriving. Seeing her succeed was as fulfilling to him as any business deal or promotion. In the quiet moments of reflection, David realized that the most important legacy he could leave wasn't the wealth he had accumulated, but the love and support he could offer to the people who mattered most. With Emma in his life, he finally understood the power of second chances, the beauty of reconnecting with a family he had almost forgotten, and the healing that came from choosing to embrace what life still had to offer. As the months went on, David and Emma settled into their new rhythm, not just as colleagues but as family. The professional and personal lines had blurred in the best way possible, and they both realized how much they had to learn from each other. Emma, who had once struggled to fit in, now thrived in the support system David provided. His quiet encouragement and the gentle guidance he offered were not just helping her grow professionally, they were helping her heal. For the first time in her life, Emma felt truly seen. Her past, which had always been shrouded in uncertainty and loss, was now becoming a source of strength. With David by her side, she was beginning to understand her own worth, to accept that she deserved love, protection, and a future filled with possibility. He had given her more than just a job. He had given her a family. David, in turn, had rediscovered the joy of connection. Emma had opened his heart in ways he hadn't thought possible. The void that had once haunted him, the loneliness that accompanied his success, was no longer there. He found himself looking forward to the little things: shared meals, laughter over simple moments, and the warmth of family. As Emma settled into her role at the company, they continued to build their shared future, one step at a time. The power of second chances was no longer a distant concept for David. It was his reality. His empire, once defined by profits and power, was now complemented by a deeper sense of purpose. And Emma, with her newfound sense of belonging, was beginning to see her own potential. Together they were forging a new path, one where family wasn't just a relic of the past, but a living, breathing presence in their lives. David knew that life had more in store for them, and as he looked at Emma with a quiet pride, he realized that this was just the beginning of their new chapter.